Empires do not always fall to armies. Sometimes they're dismantled by signatures. In the 19th century, the greatest power in the Middle East was not conquered by cannon fire, but by compound interest. You do not need to invade a country to own it. You only need to hold its mortgage. And once the mortgage is signed, the clock is already running. This is the story of the first true debt trap in modern history. The story of how the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that had terrified Europe for centuries, was slowly suffocated by the banks of London and Paris. The suffocation advanced quietly enough that by the time it was recognized, the options had already narrowed to almost nothing. Once that narrowing begins, recovery stops being a matter of will and becomes a matter of timing, because the next decision is made inside the last one. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still appeared to be a titan, stretching from the Balkans across Anatolia to Mecca and Medina, and across North Africa, with the Sultan in Istanbul ruling millions at the crossroads of the world. Yet beneath that imperial surface, the foundation was rotting. And while Britain and France were forging steam engines and factories, the Ottoman economy remained agrarian and stagnant. The Ottoman economy was trying to compete in a world that had already shifted to machines. The treasury ran chronically short of cash, and the tax system bled revenue through corrupt officials. The old solutions, debasement and confiscation, no longer stabilized anything. They only signaled weakness, and weakness removed the option of waiting for conditions to improve on their own. The empire needed capital not to grow comfortably, but to survive at all. It needed a modern army to resist the Russian Empire pressing from the north, and roads and telegraphs to project control across vast territory, and the appearance of European modernity to deter predation. For years, the sultans resisted borrowing from the West, restrained by religious aversion to usury and political fear of dependency. But resistance is easier before pressure becomes immediate. In 1853, when Russia invaded Ottoman territory and the Crimean War erupted, hesitation turned costly. Survival required a decision that could not be undone. Because once war spending began without internal funding, the empire lost the option of fighting on its own terms. Britain and France entered the war against Russia, sending fleets and armies to the Black Sea. But they also sent bankers, because war does not run on speeches, it runs on cash. The Ottoman treasury did not have the millions of gold liras required to pay soldiers, cast cannons, and provision ships, and Sultan Abdul I was told there was no alternative left. In 1854, the empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with British and French bankers, breaking a centuries-old taboo in a single act that bound future budgets to foreign signatures. Abdul I chose immediate survival over long-term autonomy. And the moment that binding occurred, the empire lost the ability to fund the war without external permission. From that point forward, the empire could not return to self-financed war without first absorbing the full cost of breaking the contract. The loan was presented as solidarity among allies, yet the terms ensured the empire began in deficit from the first moment. Issued at 80, meaning for every 100 of debt signed, only £80 arrived. While interest accrued on the full 100, the bankers kept the difference as commission and risk premium, and the empire locked itself into punishing effective rates while receiving less cash than it owed. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance, and it could not be reversed once ink met paper. Because the debt service schedule began consuming future revenue before any future revenue could be redirected. When the cash reached Istanbul, it felt like salvation. Soldiers were paid and the crisis eased, and Russia was eventually defeated. Relief blurred caution, and the Sultan discovered that with a signature in London, he could summon gold. And once that realization took hold, the boundary that had protected the empire dissolved. The war ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not, because the habit had formed before the danger was understood, and the empire had already lost the option of returning to a war footing funded only by its own treasury. Prestige replaced prudence, and the Ottoman elite looked at Paris and London with their gaslit boulevards and marble opera houses, and they felt the weight of comparison. They chose to prove modernity through display rather than productivity, directing borrowed funds towards symbols rather than engines of growth. Sultan Abdulmajid ordered the construction of the Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus, abandoning Topkapi as too old-fashioned and too Eastern. He chose prestige over productivity, converting borrowed capital into marble and gold leaf that would never repay its cost, removing the option of using that borrowed capacity to build anything that could later offset the interest burden. The palace rose in staggering opulence: 14 tons of gold leaf, a massive crystal chandelier from Britain, silk carpets, and Italian marble, while peasants in Anatolia struggled with wooden plows. Its cost equaled roughly a quarter of the empire's annual tax revenue, and to finance it, the Sultan returned repeatedly to London and Paris in 1855, 1858, and 1860. Each loan deepened dependency, and each signature converted future tax receipts into pre-committed payments, shrinking the portion of the budget that could be redirected when crisis struck. With each issuance, lenders priced the empire not on promise but on precedent, raising the cost of the next signature. By the 1860s, the structure had shifted from borrowing to survive toward borrowing to service borrowing. Tax revenue could no longer cover interest on existing loans, and new loans were floated to pay old coupons, converting temporary strain into systemic fragility. Debt payments climbed from perhaps 15% of income in 1860 to over 50% by 1870, meaning half of every coin collected from fishermen in Greece or farmers in Syria exited the empire immediately. What remained had to cover the entire machinery of the state, leaving governance to operate on whatever survived the transfer. The state hollowed from within as army payrolls, naval maintenance, school construction, and road repair began competing directly with bond coupons. Once the coupons took priority, every reform required first clearing a payment due in London. To bridge gaps between major European loans, the government turned to the Galata bankers in Istanbul, borrowing short-term at rates of 18% or 20% when the treasury ran dry. Each bridge loan narrowed the path forward and increased the cost of delay, because it forced the next European borrowing to arrive already pre-spent and at a weaker bargaining position. Sultan Abdulaziz compounded the pressure by expanding military purchases, commissioning ironclads from British shipyards and cannons from Germany, briefly creating the third-largest navy on paper. Yet the fleet rusted in the Golden Horn for lack of coal, a visible monument to debt-funded ambition without operating capacity. And once maintenance became unaffordable, the empire lost the option of using that naval power as leverage in the diplomacy that might have bought time. In 1873, the structure cracked, and a financial panic in Vienna triggered the Long Depression, and global capital tightened precisely when the Ottomans needed refinancing. Simultaneously, drought devastated Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. Crops failed and livestock died. Tax bases collapsed, and collectors found villages unable to pay. Revenue evaporated while debt payments remained fixed, and the empire's final margin disappeared. By summer 1875, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim Pasha confronted ledgers that offered no solution, and a major payment to European bondholders loomed in October. But no new loans were available, and cash reserves were empty. The empire faced a stark choice: starve its own population to satisfy creditors, or suspend payment and shatter its credit. On October 6, 1875, the Decree of Ramadan announced that debt service would be cut in half, with 50% paid in cash and 50% in paper promises. The government chose to preserve domestic survival at the cost of foreign trust, and it was, in financial terms, a default. And once declared, access to capital markets closed. With that closure, the empire lost the option of buying breathing room with fresh borrowing. And when markets eventually reopened, they would do so at terms reflecting that break in trust. With capital markets closed, the consequences arrived immediately in diplomacy. And the reaction in Europe was furious. Middle-class investors in Britain and France who had purchased Ottoman bonds saw savings erased. Newspapers denounced the Turks as swindlers, and diplomatic support against Russia dissipated. Financial weakness translated instantly into geopolitical exposure, because without credit and without patrons, the empire could no longer choose which threats to deter and which to ignore. In 1877, Russia declared war, calculating that a bankrupt and isolated empire could not resist. The Russo-Turkish War proved catastrophic. Unpaid and undersupplied forces faltered. Russian troops advanced to the outskirts of Istanbul, and the empire signed a humiliating treaty ceding vast territories. The peace imposed an indemnity of over 800 million francs, adding new obligations atop defaulted bonds. And those indemnity payments carried the same fixed priority, stacking claims on a revenue base that had already failed. The debt burden now exceeded the productive capacity of the empire, meaning even full taxation and administrative efficiency could not generate enough surplus to meet fixed obligations. Sultan Abdul Hamid II inherited a state stripped of credit, territory, and leverage. European powers did not rush to annex land directly because territorial conquest required administration and troops, and instead they pursued a cleaner form of control. In 1881, representatives of European bondholders arrived in Istanbul not with armies, but with terms. And the decree of Muharrem established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA. The OPDA transferred control over key revenue streams to a foreign-run body, effectively placing Ottoman income under multinational supervision rather than sovereign control. With that transfer, the empire lost the ability to decide where its most reliable cash flows would go, because the decision had been legally reassigned. The empire could not regain that discretion without first cutting off the revenues that still kept the state operating at all. And that reassignment signaled to future creditors that repayment would be enforced externally, tightening financial oversight even further. The OPDA was a corporation governed by representatives of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria, headquartered in a fortress-like building that symbolized authority. Taxes on silk, salt, fishing, spirits, tobacco, and stamp duties were legally assigned to it, and the Sultan conceded that he could no longer be trusted to collect his own revenues. Over 5,000 OPDA tax collectors, uniformed and armed, operated across the empire, answering to foreign directors rather than the Ottoman court. Once that bureaucracy existed in the field, the empire lost the option of quietly reversing the arrangement without first confronting the very apparatus collecting its income. The mechanism worked with ruthless efficiency. The OPDA modernized salt mines, improved silk production, built warehouses, and increased revenues, but the surplus flowed outward to creditors. Between 1881 and 1914, roughly one-third of total Ottoman revenue passed directly through the OPDA to service debt, and one-third never entered the imperial treasury at all. That portion never entered the imperial treasury at all, which meant the government was budgeting with only what creditors allowed to remain. The state functioned on what remained, perpetually constrained and unable to accumulate capital for independent modernization. Without surplus, growth could not compound, and without compounding growth, the debt ratio could not shrink. Control of cash flow became control of policy. If the Sultan wished to build infrastructure or expand education, funding required deference to creditor priorities, and usually there was nothing left. Sovereignty shifted not through occupation, but through control of revenue streams, and dependency removed the option of choosing policy on strategic grounds alone, because policy had to fit what the remaining two-thirds could barely sustain. Into this environment stepped Germany, presenting itself as an alternative creditor to a system already dominated by Britain and France. Kaiser Wilhelm II courted the Sultan and proposed the Berlin-Baghdad Railway, promising strategic connection and modernization. The project offered troop mobility and economic integration, yet financing required new borrowing. Deutsche Bank provided funds under contracts that guaranteed profits per kilometer, regardless of traffic, and granted rights to oil and minerals within 20 kilometers of the tracks. In exchanging one set of financial constraints for another, the empire tightened the trap. Because those guarantees created fixed payouts that could not be reduced when revenue disappointed. This removed the option of scaling the project to what the Treasury could actually carry. With those railway guarantees in place, the cost of each mile became a standing claim on the state. By 1910, German influence dominated army training, railways, and new debt issuance, shifting financial leverage away from Britain and France and converting debt exposure into strategic rivalry. Debt ceased to be purely fiscal. It became entangled with alliance structures driving Europe toward war. And as influence shifted, the empire lost the option of balancing between powers without provoking retaliation from those being displaced. The empire could no longer detach its finances from its alliances without surrendering the only external support it still depended on. When World War I erupted, Ottoman leaders aligned with Germany, calculating that victory might erase obligations to Britain and France and dismantle the OPDA. They chose a military gamble as the only remaining path to financial release, resetting the empire's financial hierarchy by force. The declaration of war included expelling British and French directors from the OPDA and halting payments, a dramatic assertion of autonomy that closed the door to neutrality. Because once payments stopped and directors were removed, the empire lost the option of returning to the pre-war financial order without surrendering outright. With neutrality gone, survival depended on the war's outcome. The gamble failed, and the war destroyed the empire. Yet debt obligations persisted because the end of a state did not dissolve its contracts. At the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, the new Turkish Republic faced creditor demands to assume the debts of its predecessor on the logic of succession. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk negotiated reductions, but accepted repayment, recognizing that international integration required honoring obligations. Once repayment was accepted, the new republic lost the option of using its early resources entirely for reconstruction. The restructured debt bound the young republic for decades, diverting scarce resources toward past liabilities before they could fund reconstruction. Recovery proceeded only after obligations were met. The final payment on the Ottoman debt occurred on May 25, 1954, exactly a century after the first loan. For 100 years, the empire and its successor transferred wealth abroad to service commitments rooted in decisions made under pressure in the 1850s. The arc from survival borrowing to enforced administration to generational repayment completed itself with ledger entries rather than battlefield surrender. Once the schedule endured across regimes, the cost stopped being a temporary burden. It became a permanent boundary on what the state could choose. The Ottoman debt trap demonstrates that money is never neutral. Loans create obligations that compound beyond immediate crises, and each borrowing decision can convert temporary relief into structural dependency. Britain and France did not need to occupy Istanbul. Contractual rights to revenue achieved what armies might have struggled to enforce. The empire did not collapse from sudden assault. It was foreclosed upon through accumulated commitments it could not unwind. Sovereignty is measured not only in borders and flags, but in solvency. When revenue streams are pledged externally and budgets serve creditors before citizens, authority shifts even if thrones remain occupied. The sick man of Europe did not fade from old age. He was constrained by fixed obligations until no surplus remained to regain autonomy. If you do not own your debt owns you.